All right, welcome to our guest artist masterclass exclusive. Okay, today we have a very special guest. In fact, I met him at last year during one of the drum fests. Okay, and I'm very humbled, to sit next to him to be judging the contestants. In fact, right, he's a prodigy. I heard that he started performing at the age of 8 years old. Okay, and I only learned at 17. So 8 years old, he was like professionally playing already. His mom had to bring him into all the gig venues and stuff like that. All right, he studied at Berklee. He's based in New York for a while, so we can ask him some questions, how is his experience. He does a lot of sessions, teaching, as well as touring. Okay, so without further ado, let's welcome Mr. Arthur Kam.
Thank you for coming. I'd like to thank my drum school, James, for organizing this. Please give him a round of applause. It really takes effort. It takes dedication to actually plan something like this to give back to the community. So, really appreciate your work. What I'm going to do is I'm going to play a couple of tracks, familiar tracks, and then we'll break into some Q&A. Is that cool? Yeah. Cool. Hi guys, hope all is well. Hope you guys enjoyed that. So I'd like to open up the floor for questions. Anybody have any questions?
Okay, so your tone sounds really awesome, and you shared earlier
Yeah.
on how you developed that tone lah. So maybe just for the benefit of everyone, maybe you can share that first. And then another thing that I want to ask, right, is that apart from training that very round sound that you want to get from hitting your drum, I'm guessing also it's something to do with your grip. So maybe can you share with us how you approach training your grip? Like how do you grip it? Where's the fulcrum? Or does it move as you get faster? And how do you train control of that grip?
Okay, cool. So the first question is tone. How do you develop good tone? So I believe I did explain this in the earlier workshop. Good sound, first of all, good tone is not defined by how hard you hit your drums. Neither is it defined by how good you tune the drums. But it really is defined by your confidence in that sound. It's really about the right temperament at the right time, for the right situation. A lot of people think good sound is hitting hard, which is a very shallow approach towards drums. When you talk about good tone, it really comes from the confidence of hitting it. You feel passionate, you feel the confidence in the stroke, you feel the intentions. Good tone comes from good intentions. I mean, I could say, okay, you know what, for this snare, that is a good sound. But if I were to take this in context of, let's say, a rock song, this may not be appropriate. If I had a jazz tune drums, yeah, it'd be a good tone, but it may not be the best sound, let's say, if I was going to play rock. But okay, let's talk about drums. And when we hit the drums, we want to sound good when we hit the drums. So as I was saying earlier, we have this practice that I used to do. It's a practice where, it's probably one of the most boring exercises, but it's the most effective practice, I would say. So I have a metronome set at 65. What I used to do last time, and I would do this for half an hour to an hour non-stop. I would just hit my snare, just like this. Just like that. What am I actually doing is I'm actually really focusing on getting the right sound, the consistent touch. I should feel relaxed on both hands. How my right hand feels, my left hand should feel. The height should be the same. Where I'm hitting in the center should be the same. So it's think of this practice as the 1-inch punch. Bruce Lee's famous 1-inch punch. As you can see, that requires a lot more internal energy as opposed to external energy. So, but you realize that practice comes very solidly. It's not to be done fast. It's supposed to be done slow. But what you're doing is you're giving it a lot of attention, a lot of concentration, just like the 1-inch punch, to really focus on that one solid stroke. Because think about it. When we play, we need consistency. If we don't self-check some of these things that we are doing, that's when our playing has a lot of inconsistency. Agreed? So it's very important, to do stuff like that slow. It can be boring, I admit, but if you do this consistently, you'll find that in the long run, your tone will start to improve. You don't have to do this fast. I never do anything faster than 65 BPM. You're doing it slow. You're building relationship with your hands and your sound. It's best to do this without an earplug. And simply because, you want to do this and understand your sound, your direct sound. A lot of people, when they start using earplugs, they tend to hit louder. That's number one. Number two is they're not aware of their temperament, whether it sounds harsh, it sounds sharp. So you really want to do this with a clear, really hear your sound directly. Be clear with it. You don't have to hit hard, but you're just trying to get a consistent sound with that focus. If you do this every day, your sound is guaranteed to improve, because you're really giving that focus to your sound, and it grows with you actually. So I find that by doing this, it made me a lot cleaner. It made me a lot more certain about my strokes. Naturally, when you pick up the sticks and you hit, there's a certain quality that comes with your sound. As you know, there's so many different kinds of technique when it comes to sticks, holding sticks, you know. One of the students were asking me, because I think they were taught where, you know, the index finger has to sort of just relax. But they, you know, they realized that I was playing it more like that. So I mean, what I have to say is, you know, there are many, there are a slight variety of techniques. I mean, if you watch all your favorite drummers play, you watch their technique, it all differs. Like you see Steve Smith be holding his heel. You know, you watch Steve Smith, you'll be holding the stick. You watch Dave Weckl. You watch different drummers, they have different techniques. You watch Keith Carlock. You know what I mean? There's so many different techniques. But you know, I think what's important is the understanding of it. You know, let's understand that, okay, like for me, I usually like to use the middle finger and the index finger as a form of pivot. So as you can see, I get my pivot, and pretty much these three fingers are really doing the job. I used to play like this, like more of the Weckl technique before. But I know it just naturally evolved over the course of my growth as a drummer. I find that with the pivot, I have more control. And let me just say that, you know, it's something that's subjective. There's no right or wrong. It's really a growing process. So let's say if you start off playing like this, and maybe after a while of playing long enough, you start to realize, hey, okay, I can go faster, but okay, I can change. Oh, I find that this way it helps me when I swing better. So you start to find what works for you.
It was really great to see you play.
Oh, thank you.
I noticed something interesting that you were trying to do there. I think I'll put it down to two keywords. One is flow.
Yeah.
One is ideas.
Okay.
So my question is, how do you actually, in terms of flow, which one comes first? Like, is it going with that flow with itself, like from inwards out, or is it more of getting different techniques ready first, then you put it into flow?
Well, we definitely need some basic techniques to begin with. Just like, you know, in our life, we need to learn how to walk. We need to learn how to use our hands and hold things. We need to learn basic things like reading, basic essential things that which help us. I mean, look at the innovation of the whole world, you know. It's really built out of the ability to walk and use your hands and feet. You know, you can walk, you learn how to hold things, you learn how to do daily stuff, and that's when you perform your tasks. And you know, people have so many different areas which they do. Some people go into Steve Jobs invented the iPhone and stuff, you know. So I would say technique comes first. You need technique before you can even flow or what. If not, you don't even know what you're doing. You probably take the drums and you start biting it or something. You know what I mean? So yeah, technique is important first. Cultivate good technique. And then from there you can understand flow. So is there anything question related to flow that you're asking? Or just which one comes first?
Yes, because at some point where I have questions like for some of the students that we're teaching, which one actually comes first?
I would say technique.
Yeah.
Technique comes first. I mean, think about it. When you first learn drums, the first thing your teacher will do is, okay, first this is how you hold a stick, and then the next step is, okay, let's do this thing called single strokes. So this is the building of technique. Once they understand the basic techniques, that's when you start going into all the other stuff. Because once if you don't get that right, you can't flow.
The second question is that in terms of playing, when you were playing the three songs, tracks, you were moving from in your drum set, you're moving from one part to another, and then sometimes you throw them around.
Yeah.
In terms of that flow, is there any like how do I put this? How does it come about in that sense? Like, is it a predetermined flow, or is it
Well,
spontaneous?
it's all spontaneous. If you ask me to play whatever I played just now, I don't think I can remember. But I mean, that is the essence of musicality. I find that, you know, if you talk to a lot of good drummers, like, you know, when you like, you know, let's say if I'm asking like Aaron Spears, hey Aaron, what do you do there? I don't know, man. I forgot. You know, I was just feeling it. I was just in the moment. You know, most of them, this is the answer back to you. Because once you understand technique, technique becomes secondary. You are just flowing. Your state is just enjoying.
Get there's been questions around some of the like people here that like, oh, you know, we want to try to capture like the authentic sound of like a certain style, maybe like Latin or like, because you know Latin can be correct, but doesn't sound at all like maybe like how you know Horacio played with Michael Camilo, right? Or maybe like jazz, like how or hip hop,
Right.
So how, as a start, you know, how do we go beyond just like playing the notes, but more like what you say, like having the intention, having the right mindset. You know, do we go read books about, I don't know, jazz history or the black history, the oppression, or depends on the
Well, you know, when I was in Berklee, that was the extent that I went. I mean, that's a very good question. And the answer is yes. I actually did go that deep. And how deep you choose to go will determine what you will become. So I took a history understanding. Basically, what I learned was that most of the music we listen to derived from church music. They were all church music, you know, used to worship God. It was used to glorify God, and that was back then. You're talking about the slave trade, where the migrations of slaves to New Orleans, and they were brought in where the slave trade area was. And how back then basically music started off as blues. That's why if you realize the blues, the one thing in common for blues is the form, the 12-bar blues. Yet how many millions of different songs written on top of that? That was how it started. And it was all church music. They weren't allowed to, you know, it was sacred, sanctified music. And what happened was people started to break away from that to secular. How did secular music come about? Secular music was basically, it derived from people changing the lyrics from I love you Jesus to I love you baby. It was along the lines of that. And that was already, they coined it secular music. And the people that actually broke away from that were actually, one thing they all had in common is they were all pastors' kids. Serious. So guys like Louis Armstrong, Nat King Cole, Aretha Franklin, all these guys, the legends that you hear today, these were all pastors' kids, because that's the only way they would have known the language the best. And W.C. Handy, all these guys. So they broke away, and back then obviously it was considered a sin to do that. But those guys did it anyways. And that's why we have secular music. Simply like that, that was how it broke away. And from there, you see what created jazz. So people like Louis Armstrong apparently is the first guy to found the language, the vocal language of jazz. You listen to Louis Armstrong, you guys feel like what a wonderful world. What you're hearing is actually an early account of jazz. That was how jazz sounded like in its early form. Louis Armstrong gave the vocal language for jazz. So this is how jazz sounded like before even all the Coltrane or all that crazy Miles Davis stuff. In its very basic form, you see, it still sounded more like blues back then. I see sky, na na. You know, it sounded very bluesy, pop. So that was what it was back then. Now, how it started to evolve basically was the understanding of how basically racism was a big thing, segregation was a very big thing in America back then, and the blacks never had a voice. They didn't have a voice, so they had to they needed to find a way to express what they had to say. So they decided, okay, since nobody wants to listen to us, let our art define itself. That's when jazz came to the picture. And if you realize jazz is all about freedom, that's why it's so loose, right? When jazz, right? You don't really hear a backbeat when it comes to jazz. It's just loose. What does that loose represent? It represents freedom, simply freedom, and that was really what it was. And these people wanted to gather community. They wanted their voice to be heard. So they started this thing called jam sessions. Everybody heard of jam sessions? right? That's how it was the first account of jam sessions at a club called Minston Cafe in New York. So they had, I think, Monday nights jam sessions where they would get the whole community of musicians to come and jam, and in return they'll give them free food. But so the community started. That's how it started, jam sessions. That's why if you listen to jazz, like during like Coltrane's time, sometimes those guys go on for hours and hours. The songs were long. If you listen to like Herbie Hancock back then, like his old album stuff were long, man. They were like 10 minutes, 15 minutes the song. Why? It's because it came from the idea of jam sessions. People were vibing and just jamming, you know. But ultimately, what were they trying to dictate? Freedom. Freedom was the main thing. So that community grew so big, and as it grew along, different people had different ideas of jazz. No, it should be more free. That's when bebop came about. We wanted it more free than what it was. Okay, we came out with bebop. Intense but free. Some guys say, okay, you know what? I don't think it's not free enough. I want to do something crazier. That's when it came out with avant-garde, John Coltrane. You know, so they see the movement was very significant back then. That's why, as good as there is, as good as the new singer, the new trumpet players, the jazz pianists and the jazz saxophonists, trumpet players are, you will never ever have somebody that has the same recognition, the same respect as somebody like John Coltrane or Miles Davis. You'll never have another person that is regarded as good as Michael Jackson. You never have another bassist regarded as good as Jaco. It's because these guys didn't grow up in that era. They didn't go through that period of segregation. It was more than just the music. It was a whole season of culture change, you know, racism that these guys went through. That's why they knew the heart, the true heart of the music, as compared to a good jazz musician that didn't go through segregation and racism. So when you start to understand the history of it, it gives you a different perception towards the music. This is just a little brief history, you know. And you know, jazz became, at one point, was known as American pop music. When they grew so big, they dominated. That's why if you watch old school movies like, you know, Marilyn Monroe movies, you realize that the soundtrack were all big band, right? Like Frank Sinatra, Mary Poppins, they were very big bands, jazz. That was the era when jazz grew to its biggest. When jazz was considered American pop music, they dominated everything. Broadway, they dominated soundtracks, everything, you know, they were widely influenced. And then after that came the British invasion. And the Beatles came into the picture, rock and roll came into the picture, and obviously, for what rock and roll's content were and what their purpose were, they obviously dominated the scene. You know. And those guys that came, that's when the Beatles came to the picture. And these guys could pack up stadiums because, you know, of what the contents were. And at that time, Miles Davis was big. That was the time when Miles Davis started to go big. Miles was famous, but he couldn't pack up a hall. He couldn't pack up a stadium. But, you know, other guys, they could pack up the stadium. So he decided to do a collaboration. So he did a collaboration where he decided to fuse jazz, to mix jazz with rock, somewhat. And he had this album called Bitches Brew. Maybe some of you may have heard. That was the birth of fusion. So whatever Dave Weckl, cast, or whatever that you hear now, wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for that album, Bitches Brew. Because that was the start of the birth of fusion. Fusion is basically two genres that combine together, right? So, and Miles Davis was the godfather of this. That's why if you look at the people who played with Miles Davis, Herbie Hancock, Tony Williams. That's why today Herbie Hancock is still the godfather of all of this. Where did he get his knowledge from to be able to do all this? You know, it's from that era. You know, he took whatever that he learned from Miles, he took it and he grew it to what it was. You got all the Herbie Hancock stuff. Stuff is deep, but you know, that was where it was. That's how it started. So you know, once you start understanding that, You appreciate your history, your music better. You play with a different heart, as opposed to just saying, okay, you know what, why is jazz so boring? You know, now when you play with a bit more appreciation because you understand the history that came with it. Does it make sense? You guys follow me? So you that's the depth, not just playing wise, but having a basic history. I'm not saying that everything I say would have been right, but you know, it was along those lines of which how jazz was created. And this dates back to the early 1900s. So it's been we've come a pretty long way to where we are now. So music kept evolving, and then, you know, from there they had like soul music, they had Motown. Motown was, you know, a very big thing, it started off with Motown, soul, Aretha Franklin, that kind. That's why if you listen to early days Michael Jackson, Jackson 5, it's Motown. You know, that was the season into Motown. And, you know, if you were to understand the Beatles, who did they used to listen to in order for them to create this? The answer was simple, I found out. They used to listen to black music. But because they were not black, they couldn't play like blacks. So this was how they sounded like. And that was the Beatles right there. Their sound. The black musicians, you know, they had that culture, so they knew how to play like Motown and stuff. Everybody heard of the Funk Brothers. You know, this was the the band that actually played session for a lot of the big artists like Marvin Gaye. You know, like What's Going On? And all this music were played by the same guys. You know, and these guys knew the language, so they were becoming very bad. I believe it was Capitol Records, if I'm not mistaken. So it grew to that. And there were other companies like Muscle Shoals. You know, you guys heard of like Sweet Home Alabama. These were basically white people trying to play Motown, and that was their sound. I mean, if you were to understand a little bit of how music came about, it's interesting to at least know that, see, because of the different culture, that's why they sounded different. But yeah, ultimately, they took the same idea, and that's what they came out with. Fast forward to now, pop. Look at pop, where is it today? Look at fusion, look at Snarky Puppy and all this. Where do we get all these ideas from? It's basically an understanding of history. So basically, here's the thing. Every new generation of drummers, musicians that come up, the most they will listen to is one generation behind them. If you ask Chris Dave who he listened to, he will tell you, I listen to Elvin Jones and those guys. You know, but if you ask a new young drummer, say, who you listen to? I listen to Aaron Spears, you know. But you see what I mean? The younger generations will listen to one generation behind. I'm not saying that they are not good or what, but the newer the generation, the further we are from the roots. And most generations won't listen back and understand the roots. That's why they don't get the bigger picture. That's why when you hear a drummer, he says, oh, he sounds young. This drummer sounds young, he's overplaying, he's flashy. Because they take out all this, they learn all these sophisticated things, but they don't understand the heart of the music as well. That's why is it the smart, the knowledgeable guys go back to the old guys like Elvin Jones. You want to learn how to play jazz? Listen back to Elvin Jones. Listen to Tony Williams. Listen to these drummers, you know, because they still carry the heart of the music and what it was. You know, so it's very important to educate students. I mean, if you know, most of the time, like when I started drumming, the mature guys would go and listen back to the old school stuff. As a kid, you don't understand. As a student, you don't understand why I need to listen to all this crappy old school music. This is why. Because you understand the whole history, and that only really give you a broad perspective of music. You know, it went through it's just like how we are going through now. Hip hop, we are going through the trap era. Trap music, still defined under hip hop, right? Well, back then it was jazz and it was bebop. There was New Orleans. There were so many kinds of jazz. That was the mood. There was no hip hop back then. Hip hop came from jazz. So they're all related. They're all relatives of each other. So if you understand, it all came from one culture, which was church. Isn't that amazing? So, You know, when you start to understand that, then you go straight to the point. So I would say, I would think gospel music is important music to listen to. Why? Because it sums out a lot of this music. That's why is it black drummers find it easy to play hip hop, they find it easy to play R&B, they find it easy to play pop if they had to play pop, they find it easy if you play blues, they can play blues. Right? If you ask, let's say, a non-black to play hip hop, R&B, gospel, all this music put together, I'm sure they will find it harder and not as authentic as those guys. Why? Because that culture covers everything else came from that culture. So I think if you understood that culture, that's when you understood music in a way where you had a better spectrum of musical understanding. Does it make sense? See where I'm coming from? So this is why it's important to go deep, not just, you see, when you start looking at this, it makes transcription look like peanuts. You see, it makes us look like so surface. It's like we are just barely covering the surface of music. When you start looking at this aspect of music, it's so big, it's so wide. And this is what I try to educate my students, because then only can you really appreciate playing music. Drumming is more than just holding a pair of sticks and hitting, you know. There's so much more to it. It's a whole culture that comes with it. It's like I was telling people, you know, it's like I always have this analogy. I was explaining this to the earlier session where we as Asians, we know what our best local food. Let's say nasi lemak, for example. Okay, you guys may not be chefs, but you can tell what is good local food, right? You can collectively say, okay, I can take this chicken rice, this chicken rice, this chicken rice. These are classified as the good ones. They're all different, but these are the good ones. These are all the bad ones. You may not be a chef, but you can tell me what is good local food. You can tell a foreigner what is good local Singaporean food, correct? Why you're not chefs? Why? It's because you're embedded in the culture. You know your culture well. You know what makes up that taste. You know what authenticity is. You know what being authentic is. You are fully aware of that. That's why you know. You don't need to be a chef in order to know. Same thing like those guys. They're involved in the church every time they grow up in the black community church. They hear the same music. They don't have to be listened. I've spoken to so many gospel guys that don't even listen to secular music or even Mariah Carey or any of these Babyface. They don't even listen to that because they grew up in such a staunch background where they only listen to traditional gospel, but yet they play R&B as though they know it so well. Why? It's because of the culture, the roots. You guys may not be chefs, but if you guys pick up cooking, you will know at least, okay, you will know what to look out for, right? Okay, now this tastes more like it, you know, and really that derives from your understanding of your culture, you know, your food culture, you know what is good durian versus bad durian. You know it because you're in the culture. So similar way, if you want to be a chef and you want to study how to cook good Italian cuisine, where's the best place to go? India. Right? I'm just joking. Italy, right? Why you go there? You start to understand the different appreciation. For example, maybe for us locals, we like our food generally a little bit saltier. But let's say when you go to Italy and you learn how to cook pasta, maybe it's a little bit less salty. But you have to realize that that is really what authentic pasta is. You know, put the localized thing aside. Understand authenticity. So if you want to study gospel, study the extreme, the depth of gospel. Listen to traditional gospel, not the commercialized gospel. Traditional gospel, traditional artists. Then from there you will understand what authenticity is, and you realize one thing: authenticity is not always the most expensive quality. For example, would you find good chicken rice chances? What are your chances of finding better chicken rice, by the roadside or in a 5-star hotel? Where? Roadside. Why? No, why? Because see, authenticity not necessarily mean expensive. You know, sometimes same. When you find good gospel musicians, they're sometimes in the smallest black church around US, you know, I mean, the smallest church you'll find, you just pick up, you'll find a good bunch of good musicians, you know, and a lot of these great guys that come up, a lot of them come from these small churches where, you know, they used to just play and grow in the culture. And that's really what authenticity, that is really what you're trying to tackle. It's not, the quality lies in authenticity. That's the real quality that you're trying to achieve, right? And you know, if you understand that, you realize that these guys don't even play with the best sounding drums. You know, I've played in so many black churches in America. I've played, you know, where I've played in a black church at one point where I was the only Asian. The only Asian. And you know, it was an opportunity that, you know, a good friend of mine, Sean Wright, a great drummer, he gave me he hooked me up with that. It's like, yo, I got this church, this you wanna play in church, bro? You know, it's black church, you know, I hope you don't mind, it's cool, you know, just play with the organ player. I'm the only Asian there. And yeah, I mean, the vibe was very different. Obviously you feel very different, but you know, in order to understand the culture, sometimes you just have to go that deep. You know, you have to take that extra mile if you really want, if you want it badly, you want to understand how to play a particular genre well. It's more than just switching on a metronome and just playing with the click, you know. While certain things are done to understand, you must know what you're practicing. Certain things are done for drill. But culture is something that, you know, it's like, you know, you can't, if you just watch the Discovery Channel and just watch the people traveling, it's not the same as actually going to the actual place. You know, you could see a documentary on the Great Wall of China, but it would be so different when you actually go there yourself, right? You learn so much more, you get so much more out of it, even though you may be ignorant towards it. When you go there, you get so much more out of it than just watching a Discovery Channel documentary, right? It's exactly my point. So when you actually go there and you actually know it for a fact, you actually realize that, wow, there's so much more to it. You know, when I go to New York, and you know, I live in Brooklyn when I was there for 2 years, and I walk down the streets, I could relate to what hip hop was. When I'm walking down, and from a very clean atmosphere, you start to feel the vibe get like more ghetto and more ghetto as you walk deeper. Just a matter of a few blocks, and you hear that hip hop music creeping in. You really start to understand what real hip hop is. You know, you start to be in the culture. It's like, yeah, okay, now I understood. You know what I mean? So culture, everything all comes in. It's all connected. You have to somewhat connect it. It's all part of life. Does it make sense what I'm saying? So yeah, this is the depth of music. As you can see, music is so deep, and to understand music is so deep. It's just, we are just barely just at the surface most of the time. You know, there's so much to learn if you really want to understand the culture well. It's really a lot to learn. So I hope that answers your question. That is how deep I would go into music. That's, you see, just by explaining to you, you have already gotten an overview of jazz and an understanding of it, which now when you listen to jazz, you start to appreciate a little bit more. You start to understand the freedom aspect of it that lies in the music. That's why they broke rules. Why did they break rules? Because they weren't treated well. So they had to bend the system and do stuff outside of the norm. And that's how they came out with all this creativity. That's why, do you realize black people are very creative, very expressive through their music? Just like their characters. They are very outgoing people. They're not shy. They're not self-conscious. They go all out. Same in the music. It shows in their music, that confidence that they have in reality as a person, in their character, is the same confidence they carry into their music. You know, they are very heartfelt people. That's why it shows in their music. When they translate that musically, you really feel what they're doing. When they press that chord, your hair stands. Why? It's because they connect with it in every emotional way. You know, it's more than just pressing a chord. No, it's really a certain emotion that goes with it. It's deep. It's not just pressing a chord. That's the depth we have to penetrate with music. We need to understand that kind of depth in order to really get most out of it. Does it make sense? Are you guys following? So yeah, go deep in understanding. This is my first time actually being at my drum school, at the headquarters, and wow, it's really impressive. I was really impressed with the layout, the concept. It really reflects a very modern way of learning, where you got the futsal, you got like darts, you can play darts. So it sort of like reminds me of when you go to like Facebook headquarters, sort of that kind of thing, where it's very relaxing. The atmosphere is very important, and I think my drum school has a very different atmosphere compared to other drum schools, other music schools in general. So I'm really impressed with the differentiation factor of this school. It really displays a lot of how modern education can go towards. It's not just about just the books and studying and focus and striving, but there has to be a balance, and I find that this creates the balance. I think the services are amazing. The people are warm, not just the owner, but the teachers are warm, the students are warm. They are hungry to learn, and there with the blend of a very nice environment, a very easy chilling environment, really enhances the experience for me. I'm using a DW drums rather than laser drums. It's a DW, they're good cymbals. Acoustically, it's amazing. I've always been a fan of a more dead kind of atmosphere, room sound wise. My drum school really has a quality in their products. They do take pride in their equipment, they take good care of it. And that's really important. Quality is important, presentation quality, not just their quality, but even the way the place is designed, the atmosphere, everything is just right. This feels like what modern learning should be. I really like to take this opportunity to thank James from my drum school for just all that he has done. It takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of energy, passion to pull together such a community, to build a community to begin with. James, you really have a great passion towards the people, and I just hope you continue to do this, continue to grow in this with humility, and I'm sure you'll be blessed with a lot of students, because people see a need and an atmosphere that they can trust, that they can grow with. So I think you're doing a great job. Continue to grow and be fruitful in your career, in the expansion of your company and your empire. 1,000 students. Let's work towards that.